Okay, so this time we're going to talk about digestion. This is chapter 9 in your human biology textbook. So we'll talk about what the different organs are, what their functions are, um, and we'll talk about the structure of the wall. I'll let you know that most of the digestive system, the wall is made out of 2 layers of muscle, like in the esophagus, 2 layers. When you get to the stomach, you got 3 layers of muscle. You have an extra diagonal layer, and that diagonal layer lets you twist the stomach a little bit as you slosh the food and the stomach acid back and forth to mix them together well. And then the other exception, you get down to the large intestine, most of that muscle is gone. You're left with little tiny strips of muscle. They're called the tenacoli, the tendinous cords. They're not actually tendons, they're muscles, but they're that thin. And they exist mainly to move food along. But we'll get to that. All right. So the gastrointestinal tract, the GI tract, that's also called the digestive system. They hydrolyze or break down food. Lyes from lice, meaning to break, and hydro from water, because a lot of this is things like, say you're digesting a protein, you're going to break it down into individual amino acids. Well, the amino acids are held together with peptide bonds. So you can use an enzyme to shove a water in between 2 amino acids, put an H on one side and OH on the other, and you break the bond, it floats away. That addition of water, hydro, to break lice, that's where we get hydrolyze. Anyway, moving on. So we're doing this to break complex things like starches into monosaccharides, big long things like proteins into little amino acids, big fats like triglycerides down into the fatty acids and the glycerol. These smaller molecules can get across the plasma membrane easier. Some of them you still have to actively pump. Some of them you have proteins that help them across, but it's not active transport because it doesn't require energy. Anyway, in all of them, the goal is to take the big molecule and break it into little parts that can get across the membrane easier. And those nutrients are transported mostly by our blood. I say mostly because we have the lacteals in the lymphatic system that we just talked about that are full of fats coming off the intestines. Anyway, moving on. All right, here's a list of organs. On the right side of this picture, you see digestive tract organs. There's nothing there surprising. Mouth, pharynx, esophagus, stomach, small intestine. There are 3 parts you're going to need to know: the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. And I want you to know that most of the digestion happens in the duodenum. Some people say duodenum. Don't really care which way you say it. Anyway, so stomach, small intestine, and large intestine is going to have parts too. It's the colon, and we're going to have the ascending colon, and the transverse colon, and the descending colon, and the sigmoid colon. And be thankful that you are a human, because if you were a horse, you'd have a lot more parts than that. Anyway, but you have a large intestine, the colon, and it has those parts. Then you have the rectum. Rectus is Latin for straight. This is that little part right at the end that's a straight shot out of the body, the rectum. And then the anus, which actually controls the passage of feces out of the body. Anyway, so those are the digestive tract organs. But on the other side, we have the accessory organs. These are things that don't get mentioned as often as they should. They say salivary glands. I would actually put teeth there too as an accessory to the digestive system. But teeth, salivary glands, the liver, a huge amount of chemicals are produced by the liver. But the number one most important thing they're going to talk about here is the bile that comes from the gallbladder. It's made in the liver, stored in the gallbladder, And when you pass a bunch of fats from the stomach into the duodenum, the first part of the small intestine, to break those fats down more easily, you mix them with the bile, which emulsifies the fat. Fancy way of saying you break it into a bunch of little drops, so you increase the surface area, give the enzymes more surface to chew on those lipids and break them down. The pancreas, super important. The pancreas is not just an endocrine thing that makes insulin, it's super famous for that, but also the pancreas makes a whole ton of digestive enzymes for use in the duodenum, in the small intestine. And um, it makes basic solution, bicarbonate-filled solution, that will neutralize the acidity of the food coming from the stomach. This makes sense because the stomach, where we make the acid, it's hardened against the acid. There are three methods that make it tough against the acid. We'll talk about that later if you want. But the stomach, where you make the stomach acid, it's strong. It does a better job of surviving it than the intestine would. When you pass that through the pyloric sphincter into the small intestine, that acid could destroy the small intestine if you don't neutralize it. You neutralize it by bringing in that basic pancreatic fluid full of bicarbonate solution. And of course, that denatures the stomach enzymes, and you have to replace them with intestinal enzymes that also come from the pancreas and work at that higher pH. All right, so let's move on. Digestion happens in stages. Ingestion is taking food into the mouth. Digestion is breaking it down. Mechanical digestion is what happens in the mouth or in the stomach when we are mixing the food and breaking it apart. That's mechanical digestion. Chemical digestion is what we talked about before, turning proteins into amino acids and fats into glycerol and fatty acids, turning carbohydrates into little monomers of glucose. This begins in the mouth with, say, salivary amylase is a starch digesting enzyme in the mouth, in the saliva. And that continues in the stomach where you have protein digesting enzymes. And we finish off the chemical digestion in the small intestine, which is where most digestion happens. It's real important to know the stomach is a mixing container area. It holds food, it mixes food with acid and with enzymes. Most of the digestion, most of the breakdown is actually small intestine. And most of the absorption of the food is also small intestine. All right, so movements of digestion, or stages of digestion continued. So we went through mechanical digestion, chemical digestion. Now we have movement, passing the food from one organ to the next. This is smooth muscle contractions. We call it peristalsis. If you think about when you swallow, when the food gets about there in your throat, it just goes straight down. One of the layers of muscle in the stomach, in the digestive system is circular. And you've got muscle fibers that wrap around the esophagus. And so this ring can contract, and then this ring, and then this ring, and then this ring, and then this one, and then this one, and this one, and this one. So when you go, it forces the food down. That's peristalsis. It doesn't just happen there, it happens in the small intestines. You're moving food along. Anyway, absorption is moving things, nutrients, from the inside of the GI tract, from the lumen, across the wall of the intestine, across the wall of the digestive organ, into the blood. And then it's carried from blood delivered to cells. Actually to the liver and detoxified and then off to cells. Anyway, elimination is getting rid of the stuff you can't digest. Defecation, this will sound crude, but pooping, that's defecation, removing the feces from the body. Okay, so the digestive tract, we have a space in the middle of the organ we call a lumen. And then around that, lining that, we have a mucosa. That's the innermost layer. It makes mucus. And in some places, we're making digestive enzymes as well. The mucus, sorry about the barking dog. The mucus will help lubricate and make it easy to pass things through. And the enzymes, of course, will help with the chemical breakdown. The submucosa is the loose connective tissue underneath the mucosa. It contains the blood vessels, the lymphatic vessels, the nerves. Those are things that, like the blood for the mucosa, that gives it the nutrients it needs. Sorry, gives it the oxygen it needs. The lymphatic vessels, those are like the lacteals I talked about, where you the lymph suddenly looks white because it's picking up fats. The muscularis, and it says made of 2 layers of smooth muscle, an inner circular layer, that's the one I was talking about that does the peristalsis, and an outer longitudinal layer. I'm going to give you, then it says that move the food along the GI tract. I'm going to give you the 2 exceptions again. The muscularis in the stomach has 3 layers, and the muscularis in the large intestine is so reduced that you only have those outer 3 little tendon-looking bands. You don't have the circular layer. Anyway, and then the serosa, the outer layer, it's also called visceral peritoneum. Remember, visceral, like very close, in this case, stuck to the organ, and because it's a serous membrane, the peritoneum, it's double layered and filled with lubricating fluid and very, very slippery. All right. So here we have a nice drawing. It's a pretty picture, and it has all the stuff that we were saying. I want you to notice that the 2 layers here, like I said, we have 3. This is probably intestine. And I say that because you see these circular grooves, circular ridges. Those would be what we call villi. And then on each villi, you have lots of little tiny folds. Those would be microvilli. Okay. So villi lined with microvilli. You actually have 3 layers of, 3 layers of increasing surface area. So this is probably circular folds, and this would be villi. And then on, too small to see, each one of those little whitish yellow things that sticks up, it will be covered in microvilli. All right, moving on. Diverticulosis. All right. Diverticula are little pouches that are in the large intestine. Okay. And these little pouches form whenever you have the mucosa push through the wall. Remember, the wall is reduced in the large intestine. You don't have the circular layer of muscles, and so that inner mucosa can be pushed out between the strips of longitudinal muscle and form these little pouches. That by itself is not a huge deal, but it can get impacted, it can get infected and inflamed. Itis means inflamed, so diverticulitis is the inflammation of these little diverticula. Having the diverticula is diverticulosis. You see itis, it's inflamed. And between 10% and a quarter of the people who have it, who have the sacs, have diverticulosis, form diverticulitis. They get inflamed. All right, other bowel diseases. There's inflammatory bowel disease that gives you diarrhea all the time. abdominal pain, fever, weight loss. There's irritable bowel syndrome. Contractions of the muscle cause abdominal pain, constipation, and or diarrhea. I know those are opposite things. Irritable bowel disease, we don't actually have 100%. We're not sure what's causing it. Anyway, here's a check your memory 9.1. I'm going to pause for a moment and you can stop the video. You can go back and look and make sure you can answer all this stuff. Okay, let's move on. So we're going to talk about the mouth, the pharynx, and the esophagus. And we'll talk about functions. We'll talk about how you swallow. The big thing that we want to emphasize there's this thing that we call the epiglottis, the hole in the windpipe. Your trachea, your windpipe, is in front of your esophagus. So say the face is here and the back of the head is here. All right, we're going to have the windpipe, the trachea here. We're going to have the esophagus here. When you swallow, that food has to cross the windpipe without going into it. And the way we do that is that as we swallow, we have a thing called an epiglottis. Epi means above. The glottis is the hole in the windpipe. When you swallow, the epiglottis will go like that, and the food or drink should slide down the epiglottis into the esophagus, missing the trachea that's here. And the epiglottis, because it's elastic cartilage, it'll spring back and be ready for the next swallow. Anyway, but we'll go through that. And we'll talk about some diseases and conditions with the mouth, the pharynx, the esophagus. They'll probably talk here about refluxing and heartburn and how that the acid can actually degrade the lining of the esophagus, because stomach's hardened against acid, other parts not so much. Let's move on. All right, so the mouth is the oral cavity. That's where we start mechanical and chemical digestion. When we say start mechanical, I'm talking about chewing, mixing the food with the saliva. Chemical, I'm talking about enzymes in the saliva, things like salivary amylase that breaks down starch. The roof of your mouth here, it separates the nasal cavity from the oral cavity. And there are two parts. Close to the teeth, we have the bony hard palate. And if you push your finger back far enough, it stops feeling hard. That's because there's a soft palate. The soft palate, there's still a divider, but it's muscle with no bone there. And it ends at that part that you see in all the cartoons that hangs down. That's a uvula. And the purpose for that is when you swallow, when you pass liquid or food back and you swallow, the uvula should go up. Remember, the epiglottis came down to keep things out of the trachea here. Well, when you swallow and you have the uvula hanging, it should fold up to block the passage up into the nose. So you swallow, and as you're swallowing, nothing can go up into the nose. You might say, oh, but I had this friend who he was laughing and then the soda came out of his nose. Yeah, totally true. Because you shouldn't be eating and laughing and talking all at the same time. If you do, you've got kind of a fight between, are we passing food or passing air? Because when you're passing air, you want that uvula down so you can pass air up into the nasal cavity. It helps us make sounds the way we do. But when you're swallowing, you want the uvula up so you can't pass air. If someone's laughing or swallowing, they're laughing or talking too much while swallowing. They're like, air, no air, air, no air, air, no air. And the swallow could come at the wrong time. And if it's down because you're passing air and then you swallow, you might be able to have air come up and push the food or liquid out. I have blown root beer out my nose before. It's so not comfortable. All right, moving on. You know, the uvula is the hanging down part that's supposed to seal off the nasopharynx, keep it separate from the oropharynx, the oral part. The tonsils are at the back of the mouth on either side. They're full of lymphatic tissue. Remember, that's where we keep macrophages, neutrophils that look for invading pathogens that need to be destroyed. That's what they mean when they say help protect from disease. Also says there's a single pharyngeal tonsil in the nasopharynx. That means up above the uvula, and it's commonly called the adenoid. So, fine. These tonsils, we'll talk about. They have little, like little box keying is going back into them that we call the crypts, and the stuff gets caught in there, and that's where that gives plenty of time. If a little bit of food gets swallowed into there, as long as it doesn't stay there, when you're swallowing, if a little bit of food or liquid passes in there, that lets the white blood cells take a look at what you're bringing in and see if it's something to freak out about or not. All right, so here we have a mouth. We have the hard palate, that's bone. It's bone all the way to here. Here we have the soft palate, that's muscle. We have the uvula hanging down. That's the thing that'll swing up to block the passage of food into the nasopharynx. Here we have tonsils. The adenoid would be above. They didn't mention it yet, but you have tonsil below the tongue, the sublingual tonsil. Anyway, right here they have the dental formula. That surprises me. I would have thought we'd do that later, but okay. When you look at the adult human dental formula, it's 2123. They have this published for all the animals. You can look it up. In humans, it's 2123. What that means is that on one jaw, upper or lower, for a lot of animals, they have a separate set of numbers for the upper and the lower jaw. But in us, it's the same. As an adult, it's 2123. What that means is right here in the center, we have the two teeth. Those are incisors. Well, we have two pairs of incisors in the middle. If you look right here, this is a pair and that is a pair. So we only count one side. We say two incisors, one canine or eye tooth, that's our kind of pointy one, two premolars, and three molars. And I know some of you are going to be counting like, that's not right. I don't have that many molars. I only have two molars. And you're right, because they pulled your wisdom teeth. Okay. But that would be the natural condition, 2, 1, 2, 3. All right, so we've got three pairs of salivary glands, and they make saliva. And saliva has salivary amylase, which helps to break down carbohydrates. And it has lysozyme, which helps to kill bacteria. Great. The tongue is covered in taste buds, and it mixes the food. It moves it over into line with the teeth so the teeth can smash it and chew it up real good. And it moves upward and helps us swallow to push the food down the esophagus. We call the mixture of chewed food and saliva a bolus. So we move that bolus towards the pharynx. The pharynx is the space at the back of the throat. And it's subdivided into three parts. Up and back of the nose, we call it the nasopharynx. In back of the oral cavity, the mouth, we call it the oropharynx. And in back of the voice box, the larynx, we call it the laryngopharynx. All right, so moving on. Teeth help us to mechanically digest food. I told you they should have listed that as an accessory organ. We have 20 deciduous teeth, baby teeth, 32 adults. The root is the portion below the gum. The crown is the part above the gum. When we look at a tooth, the outside is super, super hard. It's enamel, but it's also brittle. You wouldn't want to build a whole tooth out of that, or it'd crack real easy. The dentin is more like bone, okay? Has a little bit of give, a little bit of flex. It's tough, not hard. The pulp is the part in the middle that has the nerves, that has the blood vessels. And then the thing that anchors it into the jawbone is called a periodontal ligament that holds the tooth into the jaw. And if you want to know something really weird about sharks, shoot me a line. I'll tell you about the periodontal ligaments in white-spotted bamboo sharks. It's totally awesome. Anyway, but we're doing human biology here, so let's move on. All right, so again, we have the gum, which, by the way, the gum is called the gingiva. It wasn't listed there, but the gum is the gingiva. That's why gingivitis is a thing. The term means inflammation of the gum. But anyway, anything above the gingiva, above the gum, that's the crown. Anything below it is the root. As we move from outside in, above the, I'm talking about the crown and only the crown. Here we have the enamel, and then the dentin, and then the pulp cavity. All right, so, and here we have the bone of the jaw. It forms the socket that the tooth goes down into. And the periodontal ligament is, you see all these little connective tissue pieces coming across like that. What they're doing, every one of them is attaching on one side to the bone and on the other side to the tooth. One side to the bone, other side to the tooth. One side of the bone, other side of the tooth. And as you work up, there are lots and lots of connections. All right, so dental caries, that's the fancy way of talking about a cavity. It's the anatomy way to talk about it. This happens when bacteria break down sugar and make acid as a byproduct, which erodes the teeth. If you've already done metabolism in one of your classes, you know that if you're breaking down sugar and making acids, you're probably doing this without oxygen. You're like, why? What? How is there no oxygen in the human body? Well, actually, the space between the tooth and the gingiva and the gum, there's very little oxygen right there. So these bacteria, a lot of times they're working anaerobically without oxygen, and they produce acids as a byproduct. Those acids can break down the enamel on your teeth. Oh, and here we're finally going to talk about gingiva. Gingivitis is inflammation of the gums. Remember, itis means inflammation. Gingiva are the gums. And that can spread to the periodontal ligament. If it does, it can loosen a tooth and you can lose a tooth. All bad. Let's move on. The mouth and the nasal passages both lead to the pharynx. The pharynx opens into the esophagus for food and the trachea for air. The two tubes are parallel to each other. Like I said, the trachea closer to the front and the esophagus behind that, okay? So the trachea in front of the esophagus is a muscular tube that goes all the way down to the stomach. When you swallow, you start out doing voluntary movement with your tongue and your upper esophagus, but once you get just a little bit down, so once it is pushed back into the pharynx, this is involuntary. In other words, what I'm saying is when you start that peristalsis of a swallow, you don't halfway through say, oh, I'm done, now I'm not going to swallow. It goes all the way down. Now you can vomit it back up, but it goes all the way down. So food normally enters the esophagus because the other avenues are blocked. What we're talking about is that the epiglottis, here we have our trachea, here we have our esophagus. The epiglottis drops, covers the trachea, nothing goes in, and instead the food slides over the epiglottis, whee, it goes down the esophagus with sound effects. Okay, not really, but. Okay, so the soft palate moves backwards to close off the nasal passage. That's where I was saying that the uvula goes up, okay? And the trachea moves up under the epiglottis. In other words, when you swallow, in fact, try this. Find your Adam's apple, or to speak like an anatomist, your laryngeal prominence. Put your thumb there, put your finger there, swallow. And you'll feel the whole thing go up underneath the skin. Well, what's happening is you are raising the trachea. And as it goes up, the epiglottis is pushed downward, and then the food slides off of it. It covers the, it goes up, covers the glottis, the whole food slides off of it down the esophagus. So, yay. Hey, here's a pretty picture of it happening. We've talked about that. No big deal. Here is the peristalsis, the second part, picture B. That's the circular rings pushing the food down the esophagus. All right. So peristalsis are contractions that push food through the GI tract. Each one of these is like a sphincter, a ring of muscle. Acts kind of like a valve. When it contracts, it stops the food from moving through it. Where it relaxes, food can go by. The bottom of the esophagus, we have the lower esophageal sphincter. That's between the esophagus and the stomach. And if you reflux, if you pass stomach acid up into the esophagus, past this little lower esophageal sphincter, it'll burn the esophagus. And that esophagus is about the same level as the heart. That's why they call the pain of the acid trying to digest your esophagus, they call that heartburn. It doesn't actually involve your heart. It's just at about the same height, about the same location in the body. Things that make this more common, being overweight, so your body has more weight pushing on the stomach. Overeating, so the stomach is like super expanded and wants to contract and go back to its normal size. Things like that can make it easier to do acid reflux, to pass the acid upwards. All right, let's talk about vomiting. If you get real strong contractions of your abdominal muscles and diaphragm, you can force the contents of the stomach into the esophagus and oral cavity. Like I said, a little bit of that we'd call refluxing, but a large amount, you vomit. That stuff that went down into the stomach is coming right back up. Here's another check your knowledge. I'm going to pause for a bit. You can stop the video. You can see if you answer the questions okay. If you can't answer them, roll the video back and rewatch it. Okay, let's move on. So we've gotten through the mouth and the pharynx and the esophagus. Let's now talk about the stomach, the small intestine, structure of the stomach, role in digestion. I want you to know that we don't actually do a lot of absorption of nutrients with the stomach. We absorb waters, we can absorb alcohol. You do break down proteins a little bit in the stomach, but you finish that in the intestines. You finish the breakdown of lipids in the intestines. You finish the breakdown of carbs in the intestines. The small intestine is the main organ of digestion, not the stomach. I'm not saying the stomach does nothing, but it doesn't do as much as everybody thinks it does. All right, let's see, structure of stomach. You know the muscularis has three layers, muscles go in three directions. And the wall of the stomach inside by the lumen has these folds called rugae in them, but we'll talk about it. So the stomach stores food. It starts the digestion of proteins. Remember, starches start way up in the mouth. Then you get down the stomach, you start proteins. And the stomach, it says, controls movement in food into the small intestine. Let's be a little more clear. The end of the stomach, the tail end, so it's like from stomach to small intestine, there's a sphincter there called the pyloric sphincter. That pyloric sphincter is, see, the stomach has parts of it, like the big bulgy part is the fundus, and then we have the body, and then that narrow part at the end is the pylorus. And that pylorus has a pyloric sphincter. That's a valve that squeezes. And you don't pass all the food out of the stomach all at once. What you do, you get it all mixed up with the stomach acid and the enzymes. And then you open the pyloric sphincter and squirt a little bit past, and then you close it again. All right, so let's go through this. The stomach stores food, starts the digestion of proteins, and the sphincter at the end and the pylorus, it controls the movement of food into the small intestine. The stomach does not absorb nutrients. Remember, I told you it's not the main organ of digestion, even though so many people think it is. It does absorb alcohol because alcohol is fat soluble and it passes through the membranes easily. Believe it or not, it can pick up water too, even though the book's not listing that. And instead of the normal 2 layers, it's got 3 layers, a circular layer, a longitudinal layer, and an oblique layer. So we got that. So if we look here, the oblique layer they've drawn on the inside, I think that's correct. The longitudinal on the outside. But this part, if they don't say it, this bulgy part here is the fundus. This narrow part here is the pylorus. The stuff in between is the body. This big curve along the stomach, that's the greater curvature. This curve here is the lesser curvature. This is where that lower esophageal sphincter is. Some people call it the cardiac sphincter because of heartburn when it fails. And that means that if this, next to the fundus, this area right here is called the cardiac region. Anyway, so we've got that. Here we have a drawing of gastric pits. That's where our stomach acid comes from. That's where our enzymes come from. We also have goblet cells there that secrete a mucus, and it's a special mucus. It's a mucus that is high in bicarbonate, a basic chemical. That's one of the 3 ways that we harden the stomach against the acid that it makes, is that we coat these cells in the lumen with these cells that are next to the lumen with a mucus that's full of bicarbonate. So down here we have goblet cells that make that mucus. We pass it up here, put it on top of all of these cells, and if the acid is coming along and trying to get down to those cells to digest them, it gets neutralized along the way. Like it's coming, and it gets neutralized, gets neutralized because the acid hits that basic mucus. All right. So there's the cardiac sphincter, which in this book they're calling the lower gastroesophageal sphincter. I can understand there's less confusion because cardiac they're only for heart, but I'll tell you, everybody calls it cardiac. And here we have the pyloric sphincter. We've talked about that. Let's move on. So the mucosa has these folds that are called rugae. They make it, think like the folds in an accordion or the folds in a big saguaro cactus. They allow that thing to expand. Your stomach can fill up with a lot more food, get a lot bigger than it normally is. The mucosa has gastric pits with gastric glands. These glands make gastric juice. I'm talking about the stomach acid. Well, not just the stomach acid. It's the hydrochloric acid, which is pH of 2, very acidic. This kills bacteria and activates pepsin. What they actually release, they release pepsinogen, and the pepsinogen is turned into pepsin by the hydrochloric acid. They have this mucus. Like I said, I want you to know that it's a basic mucus. Helps neutralize the acid. Anything else here? No. The stomach empties in like 2 to 6 hours. We have a special name, just like when we were passing the food down the esophagus, the food mixed with saliva, it was a bolus. Well, the food mixed with stomach acid coming out of the stomach is chyme, C-H-Y-M-E, chyme. And this chyme has to pass through the pyloric sphincter. Like I already told you, it only passes a little bit through at a time. The lining of the esophagus is thinner and more easily damaged than the lining of the stomach. If chyme gets into the esophagus, I'm talking about if you reflux or backwash into the esophagus from the stomach, it will feel like you're on fire. And that's what we call heartburn, because it's about the same height as the heart. Yes, you're a lovely dog. It can be caused by pregnancy or being too heavy, and you have all that extra weight of the fat, extra weight of the baby pushing on the stomach, makes it easy to pass it up, makes it easy for the chyme to pass out of the stomach up the esophagus where you don't want it. If you have reflux all the time, then they call that GERD, gastroesophageal reflux disease. And it basically means you get heartburn all the time. And that's bad because it can actually degrade the bottom of your esophagus. All right, so here we have a picture of normal where the sphincter is closed, and heartburn where we are pushing the chyme up into the esophagus past the sphincter, and this part of the esophagus is getting eaten by acid. I do want to add one other thing. Couple slides back, the hydrochloric acid, it kills bacteria and activates pepsin. It kills most bacteria. There is a bacteria called H. pylori, and that stuff, they live just fine in the stomach, and in fact they can burrow through the wall. Instead of being killed by the stomach acid, they can hang out there, burrow through the wall of the stomach, leaving areas where the acid can get in between the cells in the lining of the stomach into the mucosa and digest those cells. This is one of the main causes of ulcers. Okay, and the guy who discovered that H. pylori caused ulcers, he got the Nobel Prize for it, and he was absolutely crazy. The short version is nobody would believe, or very few people would believe him. He's like, I've discovered the cause of ulcers. So like, yeah, we already know it's stress. He's like, no, it's this bacteria. And nobody would believe him, and they wouldn't fund. They decided they're going to cut off his funding because it wasn't doing anything interesting. He drank a bacterial culture to prove it, which is just insane. Anyway, but yeah, he got the Nobel Prize. All right. So once we go through the stomach, we go through the pyloric sphincter, letting small amounts of food out into the small intestine. Remember, the small intestine has three parts. There's the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. Most of the digestion is happening in the duodenum. The jejunum is the sausage coil looking thing. The ileum is the part that connects to the large intestine at the ileocecal valve. All right, so the pancreas makes enzymes. The pancreatic duct is where they come from the pancreas into the duodenum. There's also a bile duct that brings in bile made by the liver, stored in the gallbladder. And I already told you that emulsifies the fats. It breaks the bile. When we say emulsifies, all we're saying is it breaks those big droplets of fat into smaller droplets with a lot more surface area that is exposed to the lipase. And the name lipase should tell you anything in ACE is an enzyme, so this is a lipid digesting enzyme. And it works better if you have more surface area. So the bile gives us more surface area by breaking the big drops into little drops of fat. Lipase is made in the pancreas, and it breaks fats into glycerol and fatty acid. I don't like the way this slide is written because some people might mistakenly think bile is also made in the pancreas. It is not. Bile is made by the liver and stored in the gallbladder. All right, so moving on. So what are some of these pancreatic enzymes? Well, you remember in the mouth, we made salivary amylase to start the breakdown of starch. We finish it in the pancreas with pancreatic amylase. It breaks down carbohydrates, breaks down starches. Trypsin, and actually it's trypsinogen, which then gets activated into trypsin. This is a protein digester. and it is released into the duodenum, the first section of the small intestine. There's another protein digester. It is a protein digester, so it's part of the group of things we call proteases, protein digesting enzymes. Here we finally say it. The pancreatic juice has lots of bicarbonate to neutralize the acid in the chyme. Chyme is misspelled here. You already saw it should be CHYME. Moving on. All right, the small intestine has lots of finger-like projections sticking up called villi, and the cells that cover the villi, they have their own little projections called microvilli. So we have circular folds covered in villi. Each one of those is covered in cells that are full of microvilli. Those microvilli form this little brush border, and there are brush border enzymes that are in the plasma membrane of the cells that line the villi, and those do huge amounts of breakdown. But it says these two structures greatly increase the surface area of the small intestine for absorption. You already know, you've already heard me say it, it's three structures. Circular folds, which are the one not mentioned in the book, covered with villi, which are covered with microvilli. All right, so that's fine. If you want, ask me about the extreme circular folds that we see in sharks. We call that a spiral valve in the intestine. It's insane, it's weird, it's awesome. Moving on. Okay, so here we have the lumen, we have these circular folds, and then on the circular fold, we have villi, and each cell lining the villi is full of a bunch of microvilli. They form this fuzzy brush border. All right. Inside of the villi, you have the blood capillaries, the lacteals, which are lymph capillaries that often carry fat. You have on the outside here, these cells that line the intestine, line the lumen, include goblet cells. Those are mucus makers. They help lubricate the passage of food through the intestine by making mucus. All right, the small intestine, small intestine continuing, nutrients absorbed into the villi, which contain blood vessels and little lymphatic capillaries called lacteals. Simple sugars and amino acids enter the blood capillaries. Glycerol and fatty acids form little drops called chylomicrons, which enter the lacteals. All those little fatty drops are what make the lymph inside of the lacteals look whitish. After nutrients are absorbed, they're eventually carried to all the cells in the body by the blood. True, but you're probably going to go through the liver first to filter them before you go to the rest of the body. Anyway, so a carbohydrate, that's a polymer we break down into glucose monomers. I mean, not all of them are broken into glucose, but in this case, it's a starch and we break it into glucose. There are other types of monomers of carbohydrates, is what I'm saying, but the goal is to break these big, complex polymers that can't cross the intestinal wall into these little monomers that are easier to bring across. Big protein can't cross, we break it down into little amino acids that can be brought across the intestinal wall. Now, we have big fat globules, and we combine them with bile salts that breaks them into smaller fat droplets, and those can be broken down by lipase, for instance, but enzymes that digest fats. And then we have little tiny droplets of glycerols and fatty acids, and these chylomicrons, these little teeny tiny droplets, are brought into the lacteals. All right, moving on. So here we have table 1A and 1B. 1A is carbohydrate digestion. 1B is protein digestion, which leads me to believe there's going to be a 1C, where we're going to talk about lipid digestion. Lipid fat digestion is 1D. C is nucleic acid digestion. So for each one of these, it talks about what enzyme does the thing, does the breakdown, what the optimum pH of that enzyme is, where this happens, where it's produced. I know that's a long list, but pay a little bit of attention to it. It's really easy to write questions based on that. All right, so let's talk about lactose intolerance. In fact, I'm going to give you a link for lactose intolerance. First of all, I hate this term. They should call it lactose persistence. But here, I'm going to pause this and go get an HHMI video for you. Okay, I'm back. I have put into this page with the embedded lecture video, I've added a link to a video from the Howard Hughes Medical Institute about lactose. And I want you to understand the ability to digest lactose is dependent on an enzyme called lactase. Again, the enzyme, you know it's an enzyme because it ends in ase. And this is a great name. It tells you this is an enzyme that digests lactose. It's called lactase. Great. I hate when people talk about lactose intolerance, though, because it'd be more accurate to talk about lactase persistence. What this means is that the enzyme that makes it possible to digest lactose, milk sugar, normally when someone is weaned, when an animal is weaned, the ability to make that goes away. But in humans, some individuals have been able to use it for a longer period of time, and we act like that's the normal. It's lactase persistence. When we talk about lactose intolerance, we act like that's weird or abnormal. That actually is the majority of the people in some places, especially Asia. Anyway, so what happens if you are lactose intolerant? Or another way of saying that, if you are not lactase persistent, what happens is that you stop making, as you grow up, you stop making the brush border enzyme lactase. And that means you can't digest the milk sugar easily, and it's not going to be broken down from a dimer into two monomers and then pass through the wall of the intestine. Instead, it'll just go down the intestine to where bacteria can break it down. And this will cause bloating, diarrhea. Well, that'll cause bloating and gas. The diarrhea is your body's like, I don't know what to do with it, get it out. And abdominal cramps. So people who can't digest milk, they have a lot of trouble with many of the things that we eat. Like I said, gas, bloating, and cramps are from anaerobic breakdown of the lactose, and it hurts. So let's move on. Celiac disease. It's an autoimmune disorder. Your immune system goes crazy. There is an immune response to a protein called gluten. Now, that gluten is normally found in wheat, barley, rye. Having gluten in the small intestine, normally it's fine, but if you have celiac, then you're going to get an inflammation response. It'll damage the absorption surfaces, the villi, the microvilli in the small intestine. This will cause pain, diarrhea, malnutrition. There is an even more extreme version they call Crohn's disease. And a lot of times people with Crohn's disease actually have to have bowel resection where it's like, oh, that part of the intestine is dying, remove it. All right, this is a check your progress. I'm gonna pause for a few minutes. I want you to read over the questions, see if you can answer them. If you can't, you rewind the video and you watch again to make sure you can answer it. And then we'll move on. Okay. So let's talk about, actually, let's pause it here and then we'll start another video to get the second half. Okay, we're doing digestive system and we're going to jump into part 2. We just did a check your progress for 9.3. Make sure you know all the stuff before that. Feel comfortable answering those questions. And let's move on to the accessory organs. All right. So the pancreas, the liver, the gallbladder. We've talked about all these things a lot already. So what we're going to do is explain their functions, talk about the fluids they secrete, and explain how they're regulated. We haven't really gotten into that yet. So the pancreas is behind the stomach and near the stomach. It makes pancreatic juice. I think this should say behind and below the stomach a little bit, but anyway, definitely behind. But I think it hangs down. Anyway, pancreatic juice is full of sodium bicarbonate, which is a basic solution that neutralizes the acid in the chyme coming out of the stomach, coming through the pyloric sphincter. It also is full of digestive enzymes. The enzymes that we have in the stomach, like pepsin, don't work when we get them into a basic solution. We need to be basic to keep from frying the intestines. So, or keep from eroding the intestines with acid. So we put in this bicarbonate solution. It's basic. It neutralizes some of the acidity. Great, but that shuts down the stomach enzymes. So we're going to have to introduce our own enzymes from the pancreas to finish the digestion. All right. So the pancreas also is famous for making insulin. Type 1 diabetes is when someone doesn't have enough insulin. That's an autoimmune disorder usually. The body attacks and destroys the insulin-making cells. Type 2 diabetes, this is when your body stops responding to the insulin or when you're not making enough insulin because you have too much body. That's the obesity they're talking about there. All right. So there's a pancreas, and you can see that there is a duct that you introduce fluid in, a pancreatic duct, and it's very close to the bile duct. All right. But the liver, and I'm surprised we're not talking about this later, but I guess this would be a good spot. All right, so the liver makes bile. It's collected in bile canals, which go to the bile duct, and the bile duct goes to the gallbladder, and that's where we store this bile. The bile is just a fluid that will, actually bile salts, fluid is a strong word, because you can get bile stones, but it is a substance that will emulsify fats, break up the fat droplets to give a greater surface area, which gives the enzyme lipase a better chance of breaking down the fat. Oh, here's a good way to say it. The bile salts will physically break the fats into small droplets, which allows the lipase to do chemical breakdown of these small droplets. Okay. Anyway, when we're looking right here at the liver, You see sheets of hepatocytes, liver cells, and you have a central vein where you drain. You have, wow, why are we not talking about hepatic triads? Well, this right here is a hepatic triad. We have an artery, a vein, and a bile duct right there. Anyway, let's move on. So the liver is the largest gland in the body, and it says upper right abdominal cavity. Actually, it'd be better to say it's the whole upper abdominal cavity, but it's thicker and bigger on the right. Anyway, the liver is divided into lobes, and the lobes are divided into lobules. Each little lobule has a vein and an artery, and probably has bile producing things too. Now, the hepatic portal vein we hadn't talked about yet. I hinted at it a few times when we were talking earlier about the intestines. Like, oh, and you take in nutrients off of the intestines and they go to the rest of the body. I'm like, probably goes to the liver first. This is what we're talking about. The hepatic portal vein is taking blood from the digestive system that just got filled with all kinds of nutrients and stuff, but it probably also got filled with some bad things. And it takes them all to the liver, takes that blood that's been filled up with nutrients and bad things to the liver so the liver can filter out the ickiness. All right. So this is funny. They have 7 functions of the liver. They could probably put like 300 functions of the liver. If you don't know what something does in the human body and anatomy, if you have no clue at all, I would guess liver if I know nothing about the subject, because the liver does so many things. Anyway, so let's go through this. The liver can destroy old red blood cells, and it excretes bilirubin, a breakdown product of hemoglobin and bile, a liver product. I want to make it clear that this also, you were already told, oh, well, the spleen is where you break down old red blood cells. Yeah, that's true too. And we transport chemicals from the breakdown of the red blood cells there to the liver to make bilirubin. Basically, we got so many red blood cells that one method of filtering out and destroying red blood cells is not enough. But the spleen doesn't do all of the things that the liver does with the chemicals. So we got to transport some of them. All right, here, what I was talking about before, detoxify the blood by removing and metabolizing poisonous substances. The liver is a filter, and it filters out bad things, things that are bad for you. It stores iron and B12, fat-soluble vitamins A, D, E, and K. Fat-soluble vitamins are, well, you probably guessed, being stored in fat cells. You do not want to take too many of them. Like, take too much vitamin C, who cares? You'll pee the extra out. A, D, E, and K, you can take too much, and it can shorten your life. I may try to find and throw up some links to show you later. All right, so albumins, fibrinogen, those are made in the liver. It will turn glucose into glycogen, and that glycogen is the glycogen that will then store in muscles during carb loading. Let's see. Produces urea after breaking down amino acids, yeah, and that'll then, most of it will be removed in us in the urine by the kidneys. Anyway, it helps regulate blood cholesterol level, converting some into bile salts. Yeah, so the liver will take some of the cholesterol and make bile salts out of them. It will take some of the byproducts of the hemoglobin and make bile salt out of it too, when we break down hemoglobin, but we'll talk about that more. All right, so the liver stores vitamins. It affects sugar. It'll store extra glucose as glycogen, and when the blood glucose is low, it'll release the glycogen. It is capable of turning glycerol and amino acids into glucose. That's called gluconeogenesis, as the making of new glucoses from other stuff. This is important because the brain almost always runs on nothing but sugar. In reality, there's a little research that shows that occasionally you might be able to convert it over to another fuel source, but it usually doesn't work. Take the heart, for example. The heart at rest runs on fatty acids. And there are some people who try to, we could convert the brain to run on other things, but it would involve a very slow starvation process to do it, and usually end up dead with that kind of nonsense. The brain wants to run on glucose. And if the glucose level in your blood gets too low, the liver will make new glucose for you out of fats, out of amino acids, and that sugar will be used to run the brain. Anyway, liver continued says produces plasma protein. I don't know whether that's continued because they said it right there on number 4 on the because that's a table. All right. Yeah, table 9.2, good information, know it all. Much shorter than it could be. Moving on. Regulates cholesterol levels. We already heard that it takes cholesterol and makes bile salts. All right. Produces there we go. The I started to say produces bile, but we got that. We already talked about that. The bile will be used to emulsify fats. What made me pause here was I was trying to remember the word bilirubin, and now that we have it, I remember urobilinogen as well. So here's the deal. The green pigment that makes the bile green colored is actually a byproduct of the red hemoglobin. What happens in the spleen is you break down the red blood cells and you convert part of the hemoglobin into what's called urobilinogen, and then it travels through the blood to the liver where it is converted into bilirubin, and that bilirubin is the green stuff in the bile that when it hits your intestine, it becomes the stuff that turns your poop brown. I mean that. That's, yeah, kind of gross, but that's the way it works. All right, let's move on. All right, so gallbladder, pear-shaped little organ, stores bile. You can get gallstones. They're horrible. They usually treat them nowadays with lithotropy, which is a fancy way of saying they stick you in a water tank and they aim sound waves at you. And the sound waves are so intense that they can shatter the gallstones and break them up. And you're like, oh, well, then I'll just pee them out. Yeah, but then you got all those sharp edges as you're passing them. It's not good. It hurts. I've never done it, but I've had friends who have, and they said it was dreadful. Anyway, moving on. So let's talk about liver diseases. If you are having enough problem with your liver, bile pigments can leak into the blood, causing jaundice. Now, when they say bile pigments leaking into the jaundice, since urobilinogen is yellow, I would bet that it's probably urobilinogen they're talking about, but it can cause the skin to go yellow and the eyes to go yellow. That's what we call jaundice. And you can also see that yellowish tinge around the outside of a bruise sometimes. But anyway, that's what we're talking about when we say yellowish tinge. Hepatitis. Itis means inflammation. This is inflammation of the liver. There are different kinds. Hepatitis A would be, oh, I ate contaminated food, drank contaminated water. Hepatitis B would be, I got this from having unprotected sex. Dangerous sex, I shared needles. Basically, hepatitis B, this is a good way to put it. More contagious than the AIDS virus, spread the same way. There are vaccines for A and B. Hepatitis C comes from blood transfusions. You get chronic inflammation of the liver, liver cancer. You could die. Cirrhosis is when the liver fills up with fat and then with scar tissue instead of those nice filtering hepatocytes that do their job. Where they say often see in alcoholics due to malnutrition and the excess of alcohol, which is a toxin the liver is forced to break down. Yeah, that's 100% legit. Alcohol is a toxin, and the only reason it doesn't do worse things to you is because it gets broken down before it can do too much damage. What I'm talking about here is ethanol. What is even scarier is methanol, wood, which some people call wood alcohol. It's absinthe has some methanol in it. But yeah, methanol's super bad, much worse for you. Basically, what I'm saying is a higher toxicity, more difficult to break down. The liver can regenerate, grow new cells, if you don't damage it too much. Basically, what we're saying is it'll try to regenerate, but you have to be doing damage at a slower rate than it can grow back. If you don't, you'll get liver failure and probably need a liver transplant. All right. So let's talk about regulation of digestive secretions. Secretion of digestive juices is controlled by the nervous system and digestive hormones. Basically, you got two methods of sending signals through the body. One is on-off, fast. How fast? As fast as electricity, because it is electrochemical. I'm talking about the nervous system. And those signals there, bam, bam, on, off. The other one is the endocrine system, hormones. And those, you release chemicals and they float around in the body and they stay there for a while. So those signals take longer to send and they have much more lasting effects. They can last hours, they might last days, depends on the particular hormone. But in this case, we're talking about digestive control. So understand the relationship. Know that both of these nervous system and digestive hormones are to control what happens. If you look at food, smell food, the parasympathetic, that is the part of the nervous system that normally, it's the opposite of like adrenaline. Adrenaline stimulates sympathetic nervous system, and you're more likely to be able to run from the horrible bear, the scary predator. Parasympathetic chills, cools things down. This makes sense because parasympathetic is going to stimulate digestion. If you are running from a bear, you don't waste time and energy on digestion. You divert all that blood to the muscles in the brain so you can get away. Anyway, so in this case, when you see food and you smell it and you really like it, the parasympathetic nervous system is going to say, oh, make stomach acid, make stomach juices. And if the thing you're eating has a lot of protein, then the stomach is going to release gastrin. All right. Gastrin will make all the other things, all the other gastric glands release more. So here we have a drawing and regulation. Let's see. Yeah, they should have an eyeball in this. Anyway, what we're seeing in this picture, the capillary represents your blood, or the artery there represents your blood. So say your stomach fills with food, and as the stomach is expanding, you have the stomach release hormones into the blood. Okay. And those hormones that go into the blood, they will tell other things what's happening, like tell the pancreas, all right, ramp up your production. I've got food and you're going to be dealing with it soon in the intestine. Sorry, or I've got food and the intestines are going to be dealing with it soon. You better get ready to defend them. So that type of thing. All right, so nervous system and hormonal control. Secretin is released by the duodenum. Remember, there are three parts of the small intestine: the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. So, first part of the small intestine, just past the pylorus on the stomach, we have secretin, and it is released by hydrochloric acid in the chyme. Remember, chyme is the mixture of the acid and the food as your stomach needs it up. Cholecystokinin, CCK, also released by the duodenum, but only whenever there's protein and fat. That makes the liver make more bile, and that bile is going to be stored in the gallbladder. It'll make the gallbladder contract and release bile. And both of these are also going to increase production of pancreatic juice, which makes sense. Like I said, you have the stomach full of food trying to warn the intestines bad things are coming, the acidity, and warn the pancreas that it needs to defend the duodenum. All right, there's the progress check here. I'm going to pause for a moment. You can stop the video, see if you answer the questions. If you can't, roll it back to the beginning and rewatch, then answer the questions. All right, we're moving on. The large intestine and defecation. I'm going to tell you right now, where it says structure and function of the large intestine. The large intestine, a little bit of B vitamin production, or sorry, I'll cover myself here. A little bit of vitamin production. I think it's B vitamin, and a lot of water absorption. That's about it. It doesn't really absorb that many nutrients. Anyway, list the disorders of the large intestine, provide a cause for each. We've already talked about diverticulitis, but let's move on. So the large intestine includes the cecum. We call that the appendix, the colon, the rectum, and the anal canal. All true, but I also want to show you the colon. You have the ascending colon that comes up the right side, the transverse colon that goes across the body from right to left, the descending colon, which goes down the left side, and then the sigmoid colon, which is kind of S-shaped and carries the colon back to the middle of the body. And then the rectum is that little straight piece that goes down to the anal canal. Anyway, the large intestine is large because it is large diameter. Doesn't mean it's long. The small intestine is much longer. So remember, when you hear large intestine, small intestine, that's a reference to the diameter, how big around they are. So small intestine, large intestine. All right. The cecum is the first part. Like I said, in us, it's we talk about the appendix, and it does have a function. A lot of people are like, oh, the appendix has no function. It does have a function. You have a lot of white blood cells that live there because it's surrounded by lymphatic tissue. The wall has a lot of lymphatic tissue. Basically, it's good at fighting infections. Think of it as a forward staging post for the immune system. Now, if you lose that particular camp, in other words, if a doctor takes your appendix out, it's not the end of the world. So if we have an inflamed, remember inflammation is itis, an inflamed appendix, we call it appendicitis. I want to point out one other thing before I continue. Vermiform appendix. Vermiform is a German word, which is in the form of the worm. Yeah, it literally means worm shaped or form of the worm appendix. Because in us, this cecum is this little tiny thing. In a horse or a rabbit, well, yeah, in a horse or a rabbit is this huge thing, bigger than the intestine by far. I mean, huge diameter, bigger than the stomach. I mean, it's I know that's for a rabbit. I think that's for a horse. But anyway, the point is the cecum is huge in them because they do what's called hindgut fermentation. Okay. Hindgut fermentation means we didn't do a good job breaking the food down in the stomach and intestines. We'll break it down now. And so before the large intestine, before most of the large intestine, they will pack food into there with bacteria to break it down further. Now, I don't want to get off. This is human biology, but there's some weird stuff that's going on there when you do. When you're a hindgut fermenter, you either have to have a super ultra long large intestine to try and get nutrients out. Because remember, what we're about to say is the large intestine doesn't do much absorption of nutrients. So if you're a hindgut fermenter, you try to take this organ that is not real good at it and use it for nutrient absorption. And in the horse, that's what they do. It's longer, much, much longer, so more surface area to try and absorb with. Rabbits have a much more creative method of doing this that I may throw a link in for you. It's terrifying. Okay, it's not terrifying. It's weird. The short answer is they pass everything through their intestine twice. Once to do the initial breakdown and once to absorb the nutrients. But look, we're talking humans. It is human biology. So let's move on. Okay. I just went out and found a link that shows you the size of the cecum and the weirdness of rabbits. Let's move on. So here we have a human intestine. A human large intestine, and a couple things I want to show you. First is this little tiny vermiform appendix, which, like I said, that's that is that plus this first haustra, this first pouch, forms the cecum. In other animals, like a rabbit, this is bigger than the stomach. It's huge because they do hindgut fermentation. But don't worry about that. Here they have small intestine coming in. I want you to know that this right here, the circle, that's where the food passes from the small intestine into the large. We call this the ileocecal valve, okay, because it's between the ileum. Remember, the small intestine is your duodenum, jejunum, and ileum. So this part of the small intestine is the ileum. So ileocecal valve, because it's between the ileum and the cecum. All right. We have ascending colon, transverse colon, descending colon, sigmoid colon. Those are, sigmoid is supposed to be S-shaped, and I guess you could see a backwards S there, kind of. Anyway,
But yeah, sigmoid because they think it's S-shaped. Rectum, rectus means straight, so it's straight shot out. Other things I want to point out here, and they'll be on future slides, I'm sure. Each one of these little pouches is called a haustra. This thin little line of muscle, that's the tennae coli, the tendon-like muscle of the colon. That's all the muscle that's left of that muscular layer. Everything else is absent in the large intestine. So there's no circular muscle at all. Anyway, let's jump into it, move on. So the large intestine, we have an ascending colon, a transverse colon, a descending colon, a sigmoid colon. The rectum, you've seen that. Okay, the rectum opens at the anus where there's the defecation, the process of getting rid of feces, or let's be blunt, pooping. All right, moving on. So what is the purpose of the large intestine? Doesn't make any enzymes. It doesn't absorb most nutrients. There are a few vitamins, but most nutrients it doesn't. What it does is absorb water from feces to prevent dehydration. This is a fancy way of saying that it makes the poop more compact because it takes the water out, keeps the water inside the body because water is precious. You need that stuff. We've all seen what happens when this doesn't work. When your body gets something in the digestive system of the body, and the body's like, I don't know what it is, I don't like it, get it out, get it out, get it out. And you have diarrhea. That's passing the food through the large intestine as quickly as possible so it doesn't have time to absorb. The vitamins that we've talked about, that does a little bit of digestion of vitamins, those vitamins are actually made by bacteria living in the large intestine. They break down stuff that we can't break down, and they produce B vitamins and K vitamins. All right. So feces are 3/4 water, 1/4 waste on average. Obviously that varies. There's a scale that they have that they follow to describe the consistency. Hold on. Okay, sorry. I went to find the Bristol stool scale. They have a copy at WebMD or discussion about it at WebMD. I just want you to know that the 3/4 water, 1/4 solid waste, that's a most of the time thing. There are always exceptions. Obviously, everybody knows there are different types of feces. Anyway, bacteria and dietary fiber that we can't digest, are the stuff that remains. The bacteria are what cause the odor. They're what cause the gas. Stercobilin, which is the breakdown of bilirubin, which you remember was urobilinogen. And the oxidized iron is what's causing the brown color of the feces. So again, the brown color is iron from the hemoglobin that's been passed from heme to urobilinogen to bilirubin to stercobilin. It's a long process, but that's why poop is brown. Moving on. Okay, so defecation is getting rid of it. Remember when we swallowed, we had peristalsis, where your muscles moved, the ring-like muscles on the GI tract move stuff through. Well, the same thing is happening with the rectal muscles. You have a contraction that is ring-like, contraction that is ring-like, and the part above contracts, which pushes things down, pushes down, pushes down. It's basically coordinated movement. So peristalsis will force the feces into the rectum. Stretching the rectal wall initiates nerve impulses. Rectal muscles contract. You can just right here. Anal sphincters relax and it leaves the body. I want you to know we have an external and an internal anal sphincter. We actually have two muscles there. And the external one is skeletal. It's under conscious control. All right. Diarrhea is when we move things through faster, have more peristalsis, spend less time in the large intestines, so we don't absorb water out. This could be because you have an infection or some type of nervous stimulation thing. Constipation, your feces are too hard, too dry, probably spending too much time in the intestine. But we can use water and fiber, which stores water, to make the feces a consistency that's easier to pass. Now, hemorrhoids are varicose veins of the anus, basically. You have large inflamed blood vessels of the anus, and can be due to chronic constipation, pregnancy, aging, anal sex. All of those things can cause hemorrhoids. Diverticulitis. We already talked about forming diverticula, the little pouches. If you have those, it would be a spot where feces could get caught in those little pouches. That's when, because we don't have the solid muscle layer, the round layer of muscle on the large intestine, you could have the mucosa pooch out between all you have for the large intestine for muscle are those little bands of long longitudinal muscle, the tennae coli. And so you have a band here, nothing in between. You could have between those two bands, a little piece of mucosa sticks out. That forms a pouch inside the intestine. That's a diverticula. And if that pouch gets stuff in it and gets inflamed, that's diverticulitis. Okay, we were talking about disorders of the colon and rectum. We were on, I think, slide 67. So we're going to start out from there. We have to get up through 108, I believe, is the end. So disorders of the colon and rectum, we did diverticulitis. Let's move on from there. Irritable bowel syndrome. When you're talking about irritable bowel syndrome, you're talking about colon spasms, the muscles contracting and you can't control them, explosive release of feces, bad, a lot of gas, a lot of cramping. What causes inflammatory bowel disease? One could be ulcerative colitis. That's a fancy way of saying ulcers in the colon. It could cause things like diarrhea, extreme emergency, gotta go to the bathroom now, rectal bleeding, Crohn's disease. All right, let's try this again. I'm not sure why that was being weird. All right. So, yeah. All right, so Crohn's disease is more small intestine. It might require bowel resection. Literally, they could this can kill the intestines. You get ulcers in the wall. They're eating the submucosa. They're a horrible pain because a lot of nerves and blood vessels are there. And obviously, you can't absorb nutrients if you have a messed up intestinal wall in the duodenum. So, a lot of diarrhea, weight loss, cramping, bleeding, horrible, horrible. And they could even have to do a bowel resection where they remove pieces of intestine from the middle and sew the two ends together to try and give you a functional intestine. Bad stuff. Anyway, and and Crohn's disease is one of the things that is that this isn't an FDA approved treatment that people have tried treating with parasitic worms. I know that sounds crazy, but since Crohn's disease tends to be an autoimmune disorder, the hypothesis for this is we'll give the immune system something to do other than attack the body. Anyway, let's move on. Polyps. Polyps are little growths, small tumors that are growing in the lining of the colon. So you got cells dividing out of control. They might be benign or they might be cancerous. Benign ones, obviously, still not good. If you can detect it while it's a polyp, you cut the polyp out. If it spreads, if it metastasizes, then you've got to go through the full gamut of other cancer treatments, which can really, let's just put it this way, large doses of chemo and radiation, they're not good for the, they have a strong impact on how well you can enjoy your life. Anyway, let's see. So if you have polyps, oh, right here, yeah, that's where it says it. Too much dietary fat can cause colon cancer. Having enough fiber in the diet can reduce the risk of colon cancer, probably because it helps to remove the fat. I'm thinking lots of dietary fiber, absorbing water, rubbing against the walls, removing stuff. Okay, remove the cancer-causing agents in the feces. All right. Here's a check your progress. I'll pause and let you guys finish that up and or see if you can answer the questions. And then when we continue, we'll finish up. There's going to be a lot of talk here about nutrition and some big tables. Won't spend too much time on the tables. Just say, yeah, you need to know that. All right, go ahead and see if you can answer these. Let's move on. All right, so we'll talk about body mass index and health, and identify different types of nutrients in the body. So obesity is being overweight. It is one of the biggest health problems in the United States. A third of adults, almost a fifth, 20%. The actual number is 17, so that's close, but almost a fifth of kids are obese. Obesity is not just being overweight, it's significantly overweight. So excess body fat associated with higher risk of premature death, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, stroke, osteoarthritis, certain types of cancer. It's having a BMI, obesity is defined as a BMI of 30 or greater. Your weight in kilograms is divided by your height in meters squared. All right. Here is a list of different BMIs, and 30 would be obese, and 40 would be extremely obese. I'm going to point out here that don't memorize that thing about how to calculate the BMI because meters squared is a surface area. I think this slide is wrong. So know the number 30, BMI 30. Don't worry about the implied formula there or stated formula, because I'm pretty sure that the denominator is not that. All right. There's a BMI chart. Let's see. And it's a chart. You can read the chart. It has weight on the x-axis It has height on the y-axis. And okay, so let's move on. We're talking about different types of nutrients. Your 4 major macromolecules this will sound similar to that, because we're going to talk about the carbs, the proteins, the lipids again, but we're going to add trace elements, minerals and vitamins. A lot of those things like calcium, of course, are used in your bone, your hydroxyapatite, but calcium is also used in things like making muscles contract. Other minerals, sodium, potassium, super important for how your nerves work. And vitamins, both minerals and vitamins, they're cofactors, they're coenzymes. They're things that activate your enzymes and make them work. Some enzymes don't work without these at all because they're part of the active site. All right, so anything that is a required thing that we get out of food that performs a physiological function we call a nutrient. This could be something that gives you energy, something that promotes growth, something that regulates cellular metabolism. There are your examples we just talked about. Moving on. So carbs, you can have simple ones, you can have complex ones. It says glucose, simple sugar, all true. A better definition would be to say macro versus, poly versus simple. If it is a simple carbohydrate, a monosaccharide, that means it has 1 ring of carbon. If it is made out of a whole bunch of those, it is a polymer made out of a bunch of simple carbohydrate monomers, simple sugar monomers, then it's a complex carb. Anyway, but these complex carbs we take in the body are broken down to be during digestion into the monosaccharides. So starch will get broken down into glucose. Glucose is the monomer that is taken across the wall of the intestine. All right. It says, although body cells can use fatty acids as an energy source, the brain cells require glucose. We've talked about that before. I'm going to say almost all the time the brain cells require glucose. I have heard some research saying that under some circumstances, it might be possible to use fatty acids, but I wouldn't bet on that being a regular thing. Most people who've tried that starve to death. Anyway, any product made from refined grains, if we go white bread, cake, cookies. Yeah, we eat too much of that. Part of refining the grain is taking out the fiber, and we already talked about the importance of fiber, how removing having enough fiber in the diet can get rid of things in the intestines that cause cancer. So complex carbs, things that need to be broken down, the legumes, the nuts, whole grains, those have also sources of vitamins, minerals, fiber, not just sources of carbohydrates. The insoluble fiber, stuff that can't dissolve in water, it adds bulk to your poop and stimulates the movement of the large intestine, preventing constipation. I know there are a lot of old people in the chat. Have you gone to the bathroom today? A lot of those people aren't eating enough fiber, aren't eating enough of these complex carbs that are full of fiber. Soluble fiber combines with bile salts, cholesterol, and that will stop you from absorbing the cholesterol. So having these complex carbs can lower your cholesterol, lower the amount of cholesterol that you take out of the food, put into the body. It doesn't stop you from making cholesterol already. Remember, cholesterol is a part of your plasma membranes on your cells, and your body will make some of it. The danger comes if we get too much from our food, and complex carbs are a way to reduce the amount. Okay, if you take in a whole bunch of carbs, it contributes to obesity. And let's see, the refined carbs tend to make your glucose level in your blood shoot high very quickly, and that can cause diabetes, insulin resistance. It can cause you to make fat. You might say, how? Well, fat is what your body does with sugars. If you have too many glucose floating around the blood, the body's like, oh, well, this is an energy source and this is important. And oh, but they're not doing anything with it. Well, we better save it for later on when they're going to, and they'll make fat out of it. All right, so here, table 9, a whole list of things you can do to reduce the amount of carbs in your diet. Worth looking at, might ask a question or two off of it. Moving on, proteins are made of 20 different amino acids. That's almost true. There are 20 common amino acids that are coded for in the DNA. And almost all of protein is made out of those. There are actually other amino acids as well. And those other amino acids, sometimes your body will make something and then it will say, well, we use this similar amino acid as a placeholder, but we'll swap it out for the one we really want later after we're done with the manufacturing. Anyway, so what I'm getting at is in nature, there are actually more than 20, but there are 20 that are coded for in DNA that we're aware of. Complete proteins have all of this. It says usually from animal sources. That's true, but like if you combine corn and beans, you can get a complete protein. The corn is not complete. The protein in corn is not complete. The protein in the legumes is not complete. The beans is not complete. But when you take both of them in at the same time, you get all 20. Actually, I shouldn't say all 20. You get all the ones you can. There are some things that we call essential amino acids that you must get from your food. Your body can't make those. A lot of these amino acids, you do that thing where you're like, oh, I don't have enough of this, so I'm going to take it and I'll modify it and turn it into the one I want. And then you will use it. But essential amino acids, we don't have the ability to manufacture. And so we can't manufacture them. We can't store them easily. We have to eat them to get them. And so there we go. That's the 8 essential amino acids. Moving on. Can proteins be harmful? If you take in too many, yeah. It could make you dehydrate. It could cause kidney stones. Not the protein in the red meat, but the high fats could be bad for you in the long run. Now let's talk about fats. So we got lipids, fats, oils, cholesterol. Saturated fats are saturated with, which means full of, hydrogen. You got all the hydrogen they can hold, and they tend to be solid at room temperature. Butter, meat fats, palm oil, coconut oil. So yeah, there are some plant sources. Unsaturated fats are better for your heart, but cis and trans, for instance, are bad. So corn oil, safflower oil, it says high in polyunsaturated fatty acids. Poly means many, unsaturated means you've got double or triple bonds in that chain of fat. So we have a fatty acid chain and it's long chain. So long chain, if it's got all the hydrogens it can hold, it is saturated with hydrogen. That's what we're talking about when we talk about a saturated fat. But that means we can pack them really close together, and because they're straight, just saturated fats are straight. We can pack them really close together, and that's why they tend to be solid at room temperature. Unsaturated fats they are not saturated with hydrogen. They don't have all the hydrogen they could, so they have kinks, they have bends in that long chain. And that means you can't pack them quite as close together. That's why they tend to be more liquid at room temperatures. So polyunsaturated, examples would be linoleic acid, olive oil, canola oil have more monounsaturated fats. Not as good as a poly, but you know, the omega-3 fatty acids says preserve brain function, protect against heart disease. Flax and cold water fish are nice sources. I do want to point out that the fish don't make much omega-3. That comes from their foods. And as we overfish, that may not be, it may be hard to get the omega-3s that way. We might have to start eating some of the things that fish do. I know the famous oceanographer Sylvia Earle, she doesn't eat fish. She eats like people, oh, you need, the doctor says you need omega-3 fatty acids. Here's a little pill you can take. Well, you could make those pills out of things other than fish, things that fish eat. And so that's what she does. Anyway, moving on. So here's a nice chart showing monounsaturated, polyunsaturated, and saturated fats. And you can see that polyunsaturated fats, the thing that the most common in is safflower oil. And safflower is one of the ingredients, one of the things you can use that'll give a good flavor to your food as well. Anyway, so there you go, looking at it. Moving on. Can lipids be harmful? Of course they can. Saturated fats can cause arteriosclerosis. They can make plaques, make it hard for blood to flow. When people talk about getting hardening of the arteries, that's what they're talking about. Cholesterol is carried by two different kinds of transport proteins. HDL, high density lipoprotein, and LDL, low density lipoprotein. HDL, they carry it off to the liver where it gets metabolized. The LDL, that cholesterol might get dumped in the tissues in the arteries. Okay. So ways to reduce fats. We've got a list of proteins that are lower in fat. Chicken, fish, legumes. Take the skin off of the stuff and it will be lower fat. You can broil rather than bake or fry. Talks about how to season vegetables, how to cook, season food, how to cook food. So yeah, this page talks about cholesterol and fats. And I want to point out right there at the very bottom, increased soluble fiber in the diet, oat bran, oatmeal, beans, corn. You have to understand, it's not that oatmeal is magical. For a while, people acted like it was, but it'll help bulk up the feces, just like we talked about before, rub against the wall, remove some of that fat before, and remove some of that cholesterol before it can cause damage. All right, so trans fats don't really, they're super uncommon in nature. I was going to say don't exist in nature. I don't know of an example, but they might. Cis and trans, suppose you have an unsaturated fat. So we've got a long chain, that's a saturated fat. An unsaturated fat will have a double bond in it or a triple bond in it. If it's a double bond, you're going to get a kink in that long chain. If the two side chains, so we have the chain, the kink, the chain, if they're arranged like this, like here's the double bond in between, and they are like this, then we would say it is a cis fat. If you have them go like that, where you have the chain, the double bond, and then the chain continues, that would be a trans fat. Trans meaning across. The two parts are across the double bond from each other. Trans fats. Okay, so anyway, trans fats, they aren't very common in nature. They tend to be things that we make when we take a polyunsaturated fat, and under high heat, we add hydrogen to them and make them slightly less unsaturated. That can be really bad because your body, trans fats aren't too common in nature, and your body is not super good at breaking down these trans fats because the enzymes aren't used to them. There could be some toxic byproducts in the process, mildly toxic. All right, so let's move on to minerals, happier subject. We have major minerals and trace minerals. Trace minerals you need a little bit of. Major minerals you need a lot of. Okay, so 100 milligrams per day. Trace less than 100 milligrams per day. Major minerals, often they're part of the tissue itself. Trace minerals, like I've said before, they might be like, you need iodine to prevent goiter. You need iron so you can make hemoglobin. You need actually the example I was going to use was a vitamin, not a mineral. We'll probably talk about the difference. One is a coenzyme and the other is a cofactor, but they do the same thing. They activate enzymes. And vitamin B is super important for carboxylic anhydrase, that the enzyme that does the blood buffering or helps you with the blood buffering. It doesn't have the right shape to do its job if it doesn't have B vitamins. Anyway, let's move on. So here we have a table with different minerals, where what they do, where we get them, what happens if you have too little, what happens if you have too much. Definitely look it over. We can ask some questions based on this table, but they're pretty. These are the types of things that I expect if you've been paying attention to your diet, you've probably already heard. They're not picking weird things to jump out. You're like, huh? These are well known. All right, so moving on. Occasionally, people don't get enough iron, calcium, magnesium, or zinc. If you don't get enough iron, you might have anemia because you're having trouble making hemoglobin for red blood cells. If you don't get enough calcium, you might have brittle bones. You might, if you had extremely low amounts, you might have muscle problems. So things like that. Adult females need more iron in their diet than males because hemoglobin is necessary in blood, and during menstruation you're going to bleed, so you're going to lose some iron every month, every 28 days. A varied and complete diet, it says, usually supplies enough of each type, but if you don't have a lot of variation in your diet, it doesn't hurt to take some supplements. I'm not super big on supplements, but yeah. Calcium, it's found in your bones, it's found in your teeth. It's needed for muscle contraction, blood clotting. It prevents osteoporosis, which of course happens in the elderly, especially elderly women. Although I'll be honest, since women tend to live a little bit longer than men, it may just be the elderly and we see it more in women. Anyway, but you hear people talk about it more in women, and it makes sense because men start out with slightly more dense bones than women do. And so it may just be that the loss of calcium as the bones become more porous with age is more obvious in women because more women get to a critical stage. Anyway, vitamin D can prevent this. Vitamin D can prevent bone loss. And we can get vitamin D in supplements, or we can get it from, it's part of the process when you're in the sun. Your skin can help you make vitamin D as it absorbs sunlight. Of course, then you got on the flip side, you got the skin cancer option. Anyway, sodium for water balance. And so it's talking about the movement of materials across the plasma membrane, as well as conduction of a nerve impulse. What they're talking about there is that sodium and potassium are the two most important chemicals in nerve conduction. You tend to have sodium on the outside of the cell and potassium on the inside, and then when you're going to send a signal down the axon of the nerve, you have sodium rushing into the nerve, and eventually, as it gets too positive inside, you'll have the potassium rush out to compensate. You have to pump those back to their original places before the nerve can fire again. So it happens super fast. But if you don't have enough sodium and potassium, then the nerve may not work. So recommended amount of sodium intake per day, 1,500 milligrams. A lot of people take a lot worse. If you have too much sodium, it can cause hypertension, high blood pressure. Totally true. If you have extreme low amounts, like in the case of water toxicity, where people drink huge amounts of water. Usually this is people doing things on a dare. You would never drink that much water on your own. But like for fraternity hazings, where people drank so much water that it ended up stopping their hearts. Really bad stuff. Hold on, I'm going to get a link up about that. Okay, I just pulled up a link about water toxicity and how drinking too much water can cause damage. In this case, it was a hazing and it killed the person. Anyway, let's move on. So then there's a list of ways to avoid taking in too much sodium, and they're pretty straightforward. Don't use salt. The whole thing comes down to don't use salt. But there are a list of things you may not think of, like bacon, that actually are super high in salt. All right, let's move on. So vitamins are organic compounds used for metabolism. That's a generic way of saying it. But a lot of them are coenzymes, meaning they work with the enzyme. The enzyme is inactive if it doesn't get the vitamin. The example I used before talking to you guys was one of the vitamin Bs and carboxylic anhydrase. Anyway, there are two types. They're fat-soluble, water-soluble. A, D, E, and K are the fat-soluble vitamins, and most of the others are water-soluble. Like vitamin C is water-soluble. Here's the difference. You can't really, it's almost impossible to take too much vitamin C. Since vitamin C is also called ascorbic acid, it's acid, you might be able to take too much because it's an acid, but your body just pees the stuff out. If you take excess vitamin C, you're just gonna lose it in your urine. You'll pee it out. You take too much A, D, E, or K, those things stay in your body. They stay in your liver. And it's possible to have too much A, D, E, or K and shorten your life. I should probably pull up a link about that too. I'm not going to though because I'm low on battery. Anyway, let's move on. So antioxidants, things that stop oxidation. Basically, oxygen is super, when we're talking about free radicals, they are things that are really hungry for oxygen. They're really hungry for electrons. And we call them oxidants because Oxygen is super hungry for electrons, and it will mess up other compounds by stealing their electrons. So vitamin C, E, A, those are things you can get out of fruits, vegetables, but they are things that tear those apart because you eat enough of them. Let them donate the electrons, and they're not attacking the molecules that are part of your body. So basically, it gives they're antioxidants because they give the oxidants something to do other than screw up your tissues. Let's move on. Here's the pretty table. Again, I would know this table. These are things you've probably heard before, though. It's where do you get these particular vitamins? So this is the fat soluble, the A, D, E, and K. The next table, I'm sure, will be the ones that are water soluble, that you can eat all you want of. These are the ones that you should limit the amount of eating. Yeah, the next one is your water soluble. These, take all you want, you're gonna pee out the extra. All right, so yeah. Vitamin D, your skin cells have a chemical precursor, one of the things that will become vitamin D if you're exposed to UV light in the sun. It's modified in the kidneys and liver and becomes calcitrol, which makes the intestines absorb more calcium. So what that means is getting enough sunlight or enough vitamin D from your food, either one, is necessary for absorbing calcium in the intestines. If you don't, you won't get enough calcium. You'll have weak bones. That's what rickets is. Where you see, oh, this milk is vitamin D milk, fortified milk. It's to try and give kids who are indoors too much, possibly, certainly more than in the past, to give them, make their bones stronger. All right, here is the thing, the Choose My Plate is the replacement for the old food pyramid. What they're trying to say is that grains and vegetables should make up most of what you eat, and that fruit should be less common, protein should be less common. Dairy should be a little bit on the side. That's the recommendation they're shooting for. And like I said, this is the replacement for the food pyramid. All right, so we're going to talk about eating disorders. I'm surprised they didn't have a check your knowledge right there. Anyway, anorexia nervosa, extreme fear of getting fat. People will starve themselves, and to the point that they're very unhealthy, more unhealthy than they would be if they had more fat. They might even purge, so they'll like binge and purge. They will eat and then either intentionally make themselves vomit or intentionally take laxatives and make themselves poop it out, hoping they can do that before they absorb any of the nutrients. It's real extreme behavior. Bulimia is when they do eat a lot of the high calorie food, they do the binge, but then they purge. So both of these are food disorders, and both of the ones listed are based on people having a fear of getting fat. Binge eating disorder could be, that's a little different. You eat, but then you don't purge. If someone does too much purging and they do it by making themselves vomit, a lot of times the stomach acid will actually eat the back of their teeth, cause their teeth to degrade. It's also possible to get an eating disorder if you think your muscles are too small. You can spend all the time working on your muscles, and it makes you unable to do the other things in life that you should be doing. All right, here's the check your progress. See if you can answer the questions. If not, go back and look at the PowerPoints again. I'm going to pause for a minute. All right, let's continue. Oh, and that was the end. All right, we are done with chapter 9. I know that was a long chapter. Let's go ahead and get this uploaded so you have it.